All right, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for joining our webinar today about the impact of cultivating successful employee resource groups. My name is Christina Giordano and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm a partnerships and community manager here at AllVoices. I'm really excited because this is our fourth installation of conversation around the power of employee resource groups. We have a panel of phenomenal folks who are doing really important work today. To give some context around AllVoices, we're an always-on employee listening tool used to ensure a culture of trust, inclusion, and transparency at companies around the world. And customers include high-growth folks who are valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion on a daily basis. Today, we're discussing how to cultivate growth and foster support of employee resource groups. To give some color behind some of the stats, according to one M&T Bank examination of their employee data, just the presence of employee resource groups have increased their productivity metrics. ERGs are found in 90% of Fortune 500 companies in just last year, and LinkedIn announced that ERG leaders will be paid $10,000 a year in addition to their current salary. We love to see it. So I'm excited for our discussion. I'll stop talking and pass it to our panelists to introduce themselves. If you could share a little bit about the work that you do, your pronouns, and maybe why you are inspired to kind of join our discussion today. Krysta, I will start with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Krysta. My pronouns are she and her. I work at Electronic Arts, so a game company, EA Sports, and I support our diversity, equity, and inclusion team and our chief diversity officer in designing and communicating our enterprise strategy and DEI initiatives. So I'm really excited to be here today because my lens might be a bit different since I'm always behind the curtain, always in the background, helping us to kind of create and iterate on what ERGs look like.
Awesome, thanks for being here. Tremayne, I'll pass it to you next.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Tremayne Bess. I currently function as the Vice President of HR for the Strategic Growth Office at the Gap Inc. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. But I currently reside and have been residing in the Bay Area in California for the past 10 years plus, and I'm glad to be with you all.
Awesome. Jess, you're up next.
I am Jessica Balogh. I'm a senior software development test engineer at Sonos, and I'm a co-chair of the Pride at Sonos ERG and a member of the LatinX at Sonos Council, and members of Women at and Black at as well. And yeah, I'm based out of Portland, Maine, and I'm really excited to be here and talk about ERGs with you all.
Awesome. And then last but not least, Sheldon, share a little bit about yourself for the folks who are listening.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sheldon Spring. I am an associate implementation consultant at Box. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am currently in Austin, Texas, although I'm originally from the Bay Area. So Tremayne, when you were saying you lived there for 10 years, the Bay Area will always have a soft spot in my heart. But yeah, very excited to be a part of this panel and speak with everyone today.
Awesome. For our audience members, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. If you have any reactions, let us know as well. But definitely want to start off the conversation. We have folks who are on the diversity, equity, and inclusion side, whose job isn't just employee resource group support, but also just the larger strategy as well. And I want to kind of ask around just like your company's goals and how you see kind of the overarching DEI strategy really being reinforced by employee resource groups and the role that they have. Tremayne, with your experience, what are your kind of thoughts around just the power of ERGs contributing to that?
Yeah, so for me, I think a few things. One is really creating, building, and strengthening community within companies. So that's, I would say, ERG's kind of like sole purpose, generally speaking. And then I think the others is bringing to life typically the diversity strategy. So sometimes you have an Office of Diversity, it's building out these strategic components and these strategic pillars. I think the ERGs are a continuation of that Office of Diversity, and they help bring that strategy to life. but they also, I think, play a pivotal role in ensuring that diversity is embedded within a core component of the business function, right? It's not just about the representation piece, but how do we build more like revenue from a diversity lens, right? Diversity products. So I think those kind of three things highlight where I think the ERGs play in a diversity and inclusion space.
I definitely appreciate that perspective because there are a variety of ways in terms of programming, events, but also product and how you interact with customers and internally for employee engagement. Sheldon, in your kind of experience as an ERG leader working at really a large enterprise global organization, can you share kind of the leadership structure of your ERG and maybe kind of a favorite initiative that you've helped work on?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I realize now that I didn't disclose what ERG I help lead. So I am the global lead for Box API, so our Asian and Pacific Islander ERG. And yeah, to answer your question, essentially our leadership structure is one that has seen some iteration over time. So originally, or rather when I first came into the role, it was me and another individual / coworker who served as the global co-leads. And that really kind of was the entirety of our leadership structure. And I think a lot of that had to do with us being a fairly new ERG within Box. But over time, we've managed to gather more individuals who serve as co-leads for our various pillars in our organization. So we have one for philanthropy and we have one for professional development. So we've sort of strengthened and built out our leadership structure from there. And then at Box, we actually have what are known as executive sponsors for every ERG, who are managerial and up individuals who serve essentially, yeah, to sponsor from an executive lens our events and sort of, spread the communication and the advertising of our programming. In terms of initiatives that I am really proud of, we have a monthly meeting for Box API known as Candid Convos, where we essentially allow any of our members, well, there's usually some sort of theme or topic. The one for this month is representation in sports for API Americans. So we're going to talk specifically about the Olympics and sort of longstanding representation for Asians and Pacific Islander Americans when it comes to, sports of all kinds. But we always have a topic, and it's really a time for people to just come and have a safe place to discuss the theme for the meeting, but then anything else that they would like. And this was really sort of the byproduct of a very, very real desire on behalf of our members to have a space like that during these strictly virtual times. So really, really glad that you were able to implement something like that.
Sounds like there's a lot of kind of intention behind the strategy as well, just having different kind of leaders manage different projects and also creating a specific space to have these conversations and kind of a theme to go off as well, especially just responding to the virtual environment that we're in right now, creating that sense of community. And we're talking about intentionality. A lot of people who are either leaders or who are looking to employee resource groups really want to kind of measure the success or whatever that looks like. Jess, as an ERG leader also, how do you think about quarterly or yearly goals for specifically Sonos Pride, or when you're looking at other ERGs, like how do you kind of measure their success too? While I also want to recognize not over like metritizing things to measure their success as well.
Sure. I feel like we keep our goals fairly simple and rather easy to measure. We're still relatively young, and so when we come together as kind of the committee for Pride it's I don't know, maybe like 6 or 7 of us that are very involved, and we sit down and kind of just figure out what are some areas that we could see improvements in the world, in the company, how might we create some sort of impact and create community, and we try to build goals around those right now. So our bigger goals are around how do we bring more people in and build our numbers. So there's that, but there's also, things like one of our goals this year was to get on the HRC index. And when Sonos gave us executive sponsors, we were able to leverage their being there and helping us in order to actually make that happen. It's something we had been thinking about for a few years, but now we had people in the executive leadership team that could actually help us move that forward. And so that was great. And we are looking at things like numbers, but I think our bigger indicator is when we do events, how many people are showing up and how are people engaging with us. And that's kind of how we're measuring our success right now.
Yeah, I think quality and quantity, participation, what people are, having learned from the event, or just like their feedback is really important as well. And I think in terms of employee engagement, Krysta, from your perspective, what role do you see kind of ERGs having in that role at EA?
I think in general, ERGs at any company really represent the community. I think that's what they're there for. I think that's what should be like the core of their purpose and their intention. Like when you walk into a space, it's my favorite thing to see like another identifiably like marginalized person, right? Where I'm like, hey, we got it, that struggle, okay. Like, I like being able to connect with people and find reasons to talk about the things that make us human. And ERGs start those conversations, right? So I think along with having community, they also allow us to bring the humanness and identity back into the workplace. Like they allow us to have those conversations where historically it's been, why are we talking about that? Why is that a part of this? This is separate. And I'm like, I don't like undress my skin and my identity when I walk through the door. So it needs to be a part of the conversations that we're having. And ERGs are the platform for that.
Sheldon, do you have kind of a similar perspective in terms of when you're thinking about the success of initiatives, or when you're thinking about building a sense of community through Box API? Like what are you kind of thinking about or just looking for, either whether it's tangible or intangible signs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as Krysta was talking, and even as Jess was talking, I was like emphatically nodding my head. But yeah, I would say to kind of answer part of that question from a metrics perspective, I think for a really good amount of time, Box API, we were very focused on growing our numbers. And that's a really great metric. I think, it can definitely point to interest, and it could mean rather more people at your events, which is awesome. But I think our lens or our perspective has kind of shifted more so to what Jess was talking about, and really trying to focus on, okay, what are people taking away from our events? If we're having a Candid Combos event and we have 10 people versus 20, what kind of space are we giving those people? And sort of what is the benefit of having a conversation that is completely separate from what we're talking about, on a day-to-day sort of work basis? And that's why I was really sort of resonating with what Krysta was saying. I think so often, and my experience candidly in the professional world is still fairly brief, but even in that time, there's this notion that work is work and your personal life is your personal life. But I think, one, that idea is somewhat antiquated, and two, given that everyone is having to work from home and everything is so virtual, like the separations that maybe could have existed more so when we were traveling into the office for work are even less present today. So I think that the need for things or organizations like ERGs and the conversations that these groups are spurring is more needed now than maybe ever, because people don't have the opportunity to separate once again as much their work and their personal lives. And two, there isn't that ability to sort of come together in a physical sense. So the organizations that ERGs present are really beneficial in that regard. So hopefully that helped answer the question. But yeah, essentially really trying to look at quality over quantity, being very intentional, as you were saying, Christina, about the kinds of events that we're putting on, and what are the major goals that we're trying to drive with each of them. And then ultimately just serving as a space for people to come as they are, and not have to feel like they have to bring any sort of professional, I don't even really know the word, but yeah, just come as they are, be who they are.
Yeah, and there's research behind if people do feel like there is a sense of community, connectedness, even across kind of departments, you're not working with people on a day-to-day basis, people are more likely to enjoy their jobs and stay longer, retention, which is important for someone individually and as a company too. Tremayne, from your kind of leadership perspective and your experience in ERGs, I'm sure people are coming to you and saying like, to show their success in kind of programs, events, are there any kind of metrics that you really look to building a sense of community, to employee engagement, retention, any or all of the above?
Yeah, so specifically, and I'm a big component, a proponent on community, but I'm also a big proponent on connecting our mission and our charter, our goals to the business. Because I think just in my experience, you can talk to leaders all day, but I think the more you can talk to them in their language that they understand, I think you gain their attention quicker that way. So I'll give you an example. During my first stint at the Gap, this is my second and hopefully my last, but this is my first stint at the Gap. I was a co-president of the Black Employee Resource Group. And we partnered with the loyalty and payments team and launched the first diversity e-gift card on that site. So this is years ago back then, where if you would have visited Gap's website, you probably just would have seen generic e-gift cards like Merry Christmas, congratulations, that type of thing. We did some research and we did a mock-up of a virtual e-gift card and launched the first one in June for Pride Month. And it became one of the highest revenue generating e-gift cards on the site. And so the payments team, the SVP at that time, came back to us and said, hey, well, this is going great. Like, do you all have any other ideas? And before I left, I think we launched 6 more diversity. I think there was one around Quinceañera, Lunar New Year, Boxing Day. So there was like several that we launched, but that was a way specifically to speak their language, and you saw the profit that it brought to the company. So to me, those type of metrics speaks volumes. So
I think that's an important note to highlight too, just building off of the point you mentioned earlier in terms of the impact you're having on the organization at large too, and the opportunity to touch customers and product and really innovate as well, inclusive design, if you will, representation. Krysta, are you seeing kind of similar kind of participation with ERGs getting involved in products at EA as well?
Yeah, and I think there's like this phrase that I've heard across a couple of different companies and ERGs, which is nothing about us without us. So historically, right, characters have been created or products have been created from the ideas or the assumptions of what identity looks like. So the fact that you have these groups of people who are essentially experts in their experience and what it looks like to have that identity is often an untapped resource. Like, I think find ways to create ERG focus groups, find ways to collab with ERG leaders and bring them into the conversation. What happens is a lot of time at the end of a product cycle or a service cycle, they might be like, hey, Pride, can you take a look at this and let's check a box and make sure it's okay. You have to be super intentional about actually baking in and layering in inclusive design into your product and project management system.
I think formalizing that process and making sure you're setting a space for it as well is really important, and you're not one-off slacking someone or asking them last minute to review something to, again, check the box. It's not what we're trying to do here. Again, being intentional, authentic, and genuine in your approach to really build really great products and an experience for everyone. Are you seeing something kind of similar at Sonos, Jess, where you're having an impact on the products?
Yeah, for sure. I think ERGs have an opportunity to help the company show a public face of diversity, equity, inclusion in a way that's really authentic. And so last year, when we were trying to figure out how to celebrate Pride virtually for the first time, we started back in, I think, January or March, and And we started talking to our Sonos radio team, and we had just launched Sonos Radio, and we said, hey, this is a really cool platform. Is there a way we can make a station that's kind of curated by us and put it out there? And the radio team was behind it. And so we were able to make something really authentic. We gathered the songs, we did voiceovers and station identifications. We said, here are some artists we think would be great to interview. And we put it out there, and it's been great. It allows people to get a feel of like what is important to us music-wise in our community. And it was a great way to bring our allies in as well. And since that station launched, many of the other ERGs have been able to launch stations as well. So Black At has one, Women At has one. And we did a refresh of Pride At this past June. So I think that's one way. Also, it's an opportunity to stop and say, in the middle of the development cycle, as you're working on something, is this as inclusive as it could be? And you have ERGs to help you bring those subjects up. You have a path and people to talk to. So you're not just kind of just yelling it out there and letting it fall, but someone to help you carry it along. So there's lots of ways that ERGs can be part of the product development cycle for sure.
I think in those examples too, whether it is an e-gift card or kind of the opportunity to curate the kind of selection there, you're having an opportunity to have a voice outside of the company as well. And I think that speaks volumes and is really important. And you mentioned kind of how the other employee resource groups as well were inspired to kind of lead their own initiatives too. And I do want to bring up the topic of intersectionality when you have a lot of different employee resource groups too, in terms of events or just really supporting one another. How do you see intersectionality really manifesting at EA, Krysta?
Yes, I am probably annoyingly pro intersectionality. And when you're like, I think of identity as something that's broken up into nuances, right? So if we're not talking about intersectionality, we're not talking about the narrative of personhood. We're not talking about the entire person and being. So I think the way that it manifests as it should is in a lot of like collaborative programming and like thoughtful partnerships. When an example is like, if you're talking about mental health, there's no way there isn't intersectionality when you're talking about mental health. Like it's a layer, it's a nuance of identity that exists in all of the genders across the spectrum, right? So that's the idea, is that I think the more thoughtful we get about programming and building topics and conversations around intersectionality, the greater opportunity there is for unity. That way it's not the Asian community talking about hashtag Stop Asian Hate. That way it's not the Black community talking about Black Lives Matter. It's all of us understanding the role that we play in these communities and how our identity is affected and influenced by those two.
I think that's a good example too around kind of mental health. There's so many different ways you can go with that conversation, and it is nuanced, and we have to acknowledge that and also work together to kind of have those hard conversations. They're definitely not easy. Jess, do you have other kind of examples or just ways you see folks working together at Sonos or things that you're working on as well?
Yeah, it's funny. Intersectionality was a major theme for us this year in Pride At. We wanted to take the opportunity to help the company understand why it's so important. And so everything we did was around that. And one of the nice things that we do is we have a monthly meeting where all the ERGs come together and use that as an opportunity to discuss what's important to us, allowing us to see the areas that we're all impacted by. And then, right there, that's that intersection between these groups. And then it also gives us the opportunity to figure out how we can work together. So a good example of that would be for Latinx Heritage Month last year. Latinx reached out to our Black At colleagues and said, hey, we want to talk about the Black experience within the Latinx community because that's one that's often overlooked. So let's figure out how we can work together on this. This is something we think is really important, and we would love your help. And we came together and we had a really great kind of fireside chat on that with some like videos that we watched ahead of time, and some really great discussion came out of that. So I think anytime that we can work together as groups and find those commonalities between us in our struggle for equity and inclusion, I think those are opportunities that are very powerful and important. And so ERGs lead the way there in a lot of ways.
I love that. I think the saying is, when your ship rises, all ships rise, or something like that. And I think there's a huge opportunity to just work together and find those ways that you can have these conversations or share resources or anything like that as well. And we're talking about product development, employee engagement, events, programming. Sheldon and Jess, you have full-time jobs outside of your role as employee resource group leaders. I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that companies like LinkedIn are compensating their ERG leaders financially, in addition to their salaries as well. And it's really important to compensate and recognize leaders in a variety of ways. I do want to open up the conversation to ask how ERG leaders, can be or should be compensated and celebrated at your companies, or any of kind of your thoughts there. I'll pass it to Sheldon first.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I think that LinkedIn's recent news about compensating their ERG leaders is such a powerful statement. And truth be told, it's caused a lot of conversation amongst the ERG leaders at Box, because while recognition and the opportunity to speak in front of colleagues and at various events is nice, and the accolade, not even really the accolades, but like the nice Slack messages and the praise for when an event goes really well are also very gratifying. I think compensating employees is a very concrete way of saying, hey, you are appreciated, and we understand that the time that you put in outside of your day-to-day role is noticed and acknowledged. And I mean, yeah, when I first saw the LinkedIn news, it made complete sense to me, because I don't know if Jess, you can relate to this. It really does feel like a second job at times, and it ebbs and flows, but there are certain months within the year that it's a lot of dedication. And so what I'm trying to get at is being compensated would be amazing. I think that if all companies were able to kind of have a very real conversation with upper management or director level or really executive level individuals and think about making a fund or making a budget for that, that would be awesome. It also would help with I think getting people to take part and really take on leadership positions, because at Box, it can be really difficult within the Box API org to get people to volunteer for these things, because it is such a time commitment. So I think it could help alleviate some of that stress as well. But at Box, one thing that the company is doing is actually taking our company's community building pillar and formally recognizing that when it comes to end of year reviews. So actually taking the step to say, hey, when looking at your performance, yes, sort of your job specific responsibilities are obviously going to be a consideration point, but how are you contributing, whether it's through ERGs, whether it's through helping to train new hires, whatever it may look like, how are you making an impact from a community perspective at Box is something that's actually been formalized, which I think is super, super great, and definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, formalizing it and baking it into performance reviews, I think, is really helpful, and recognizing that it is at times, or all the time, like a second job that really everyone in the company benefits from. I think that's important to know. Jess, as another kind of leader, what are your thoughts around how you want to be like recognized and celebrated for the work that you are putting together as well?
Yeah, I mean, compensation would be great. But aside from that, I think Sonos does try to do a good job of recognizing us in company-wide meetings and talking about the things that we're working on, so people are aware of what we've been doing. Because unless you're part of the community, you may not understand the impact that we're having. So I think there's recognition there that's been great. and also building into the performance review cycle, the work that we do in recognizing the leadership skills that we're gaining and putting those towards our performance reviews as well. I've been very lucky as well that my team knows that I'm involved in these ERGs. And if I say I have to miss a meeting for an ERG related thing, there's no pushback on that. It's just accepted that this is something that I am a part of. And, I'm encouraged to continue gaining skills that way as well. So I find that helpful. I think finding other ways of recognizing the work though, and the real-time commitment does make sense. And we haven't really broached the subject in the ERGs at Sonos yet, but I think it's definitely something that we will be talking about in the future.
I think that definitely makes sense. Number one, compensation and performance reviews and making sure that it is recognized. But I do want to react to your comment around team support and making sure that your manager knows and supports you as well. As a former ERG leader, not booking time over, the monthly meeting, something is really important to me, and not putting it as a second or third priority, because oftentimes people, it is something that you're passionate about as well. Tremayne, what are your thoughts on, an ERG leader yourself and someone who's been in the field a while around kind of compensation and recognizing all of the work that goes into what we're talking about today?
I think it's, to me, compensation and I think compensation is easy, in my opinion. I mean, especially for some companies, you have the budget, just cut the check, right? That's the easy part, but it's the and piece. So I'm not comfortable with just compensation. I need the compensation, and I need commitment from your senior leaders to increase attendance at employee-sponsored, like ERG-sponsored events. I need commitment from the leaders to challenge anytime that you have a hire or that you're promoting, to make sure that you have diverse slate of applicant pools, right? I need you to make sure that when you're doing your succession planning, that there's diversity embedded within that there's diversity embedded all throughout from a culture standpoint. I just would not be okay with the compensation piece, in my opinion, because I think that's easy. So it's the compensation and, and everything else.
Yes, I think that is really important to note. So it sounds like one of the things that kind of is kind of a mistake or a misconception is that you can, and again, around the theme of checking a box once you compensate, but it's a strategic kind of initiative that we're having that conversation of and not a period at the end of the sentence. I like that. Are there any other kind of mistakes that you've seen either companies or people who are starting employee resource groups kind of make that you want folks to avoid, Tremayne?
Absolutely. I think a few. One is the silo approach. I think sometimes it is ERGs, because we're so focused on, this ERG and this ERG, we don't do enough cross-functional collaboration. I think so just operating in a silo. I think not focusing on the business goals. I think that sometimes we heavily index on community and not, there's a disconnect from the business goals. And I think sometimes that's, just in my opinion, I think we need to do better there. And I think sometimes we are too distinct in our this, and it leads to other people feeling excluded. And I don't think diversity was created for people to feel excluded. And so I say this sometimes even at the Gap. So the Gap is, and a lot of people know this, it's public, we're 76%, 77% women, and 20+% men. Well, in the fashion industry, typically, if you are the Caucasian heterosexual male, you are truly the minority. So there should probably be a group for you because clearly you are the minority in that setting. But you don't want that group feeling like they are excluded, right? When in so many cases it can be. So how do we just keep true inclusivity, as the main goal, and not exclude, as we're trying to amplify uniqueness and community. So those are just a few mistakes that I've seen.
I think that's interesting, and I definitely want to kind of touch on the allies and community piece as well. Krysta, in your work, have you seen any kind of trends in folks starting ERGs or just like cautionary kind of tales there for people when they are kind of doing initiatives or like silos like Tremayne was talking about?
Yeah, I think that the evolution of ERGs is in a different place. But I know originally it was kind of like a cookie instead of a seat at the table, right? It's like, hey, you can have this and you get to plan events and we're going to celebrate and eat empanadas once a year. So the idea is, how do we evolve away from that in spaces where ERGs have already been created with that kind of foundation? How do we start to really build greater connectedness and alignment, like Tremayne was saying, with our business goals, with like representation, equitable process, inclusive culture? Like, how do we really start to leverage ERGs to help us move the needle? Because what happens is ERGs end up being like this muddled like work club where they are responsible for retention. And then they're also responsible for improving work culture. And they're also responsible for recruiting employees to the company too. So, or like hearing concerns from the community. So they become like this HR function. And that's not at all what it should be, because like we've been saying, they already have a whole other job that they have to be good at and they're probably amazing at. So just figuring out that balance when defining your charter. What's our purpose? Why do we exist as an ERG? Is it just so people feel good, or is it to create change in a different kind of way?
Yes, purpose. Having a purpose behind one event, one program, having a purpose behind the employee resource group itself. I think especially when you are starting out, you can't prioritize everything, otherwise it's not, then you're not prioritizing. So you have to prioritize your time and understand kind of what the impact you want to make initially, and then just organize it as such, and really not rely on ERGs to fix everything and anything. Jess, in terms of kind of allies, when you're thinking about events and those who identify as part of the community, and I know you're a part of multiple ERGs too, in terms of membership, when you're creating either content or just like creating events, how do you think about kind of spaces that are for members who identify with the community and allies, or spaces that are just for those who identify?
So we have kind of a mixture of both. We have a lot of Slack channels for our ERGs, and some of our ERGs have decided to keep a very like private Slack channel for just the constituency alone, allowing them to have a very safe place within a public channel as well that allows anyone to join and post things that they find interesting or helpful. So that's kind of one way. But I think when we're planning events, we try to think about, what does this community need first? Like, the community comes first in this case. And then how can we bring allies in and make them feel welcome? And part of what we do is trying to also help allies understand how to be allies, because sometimes that can be kind of a stumbling block for some people. They want to be involved, but they're afraid of making the wrong move, saying the wrong thing. And so helping people understand like what it means to be an ally is a good step there. And we have like an ally group at Sonos now. So it's a group of people that come together to learn allyship skills and kind of do the work and that sort of thing. So with those combined, you can kind of then have a little more freedom to create something and know that it should still be a safe space for that community, but you can bring more people in. So, and everything that we do, we always say like, allies welcome. Please help us allies. We would love your help, allies. Like, there is room for you here. You are welcome. So letting people know that we do want allies. It's not just an exclusive club. It's kind of an exclusive club, but it's not just an exclusive club. The more the merrier. The more people we bring along, the better for everybody. So.
The more the merrier. I like that mentality, and just explicitly saying, allies need to be part of the conversation and making space to really create education around that is really important, and what that looks like too. Again, it might be subjective for just individuals, but doing the internal work with a capital W, very to the conversation in the audience talking about executive sponsorship. And I know we touched on it a little bit, but just getting into kind of what that looks like. This person is asking, do you think the traditional executive sponsorship approach of C-level employees advocating for different ERGs should be kind of the format, or have you seen other ways work? Their full disclosure is that their C-level execs are almost all white men, and kind of want to know if there's any kind of creative strategies to look at executive sponsorship in another way. Sheldon, I'll pass it to you because I think you mentioned that you do have executive sponsors, and like what that looks like for Box API.
Yeah, so Box API actually is somewhat unique. All of the other ERGs at Box only have a single executive sponsor, but we actually asked if we could have 2 executive sponsors. So they actually both identify as API. So I think in the framing of the question, they are both a part of the community, but to respond to the question submitter, maybe finding someone who is a C-suite executive, maybe is a white male, but then also having an executive sponsor who identifies as part of the community that the ERG stands for. And I think the conversation that we've been having is a really good segue into this question, because even if someone maybe doesn't belong to the community, that does not mean that they can't then be a voice and be an advocate and amplify the voices within that community. And oftentimes, I think, you know, Tremayne made a really good example within the fashion industry, but speaking directly about tech, it is usually heterosexual white men who have the biggest space and who have the largest voice. So I think in going into conversations or going into, because at Box, executive sponsors actually undergo kind of like an interview process where leaders of the ERG kind of sit down with them and say, hey, here's what we're about. What do you want to bring to the table? And I think that's a really good way of going about it. But specifically speaking to someone who maybe doesn't identify with the community, having conversations about, okay, given that that's the case, what would your position be as an ally, and what are some tangible ways that you would be able to speak and really amplify, you know, the goals and the aspirations of our group and what we're trying to accomplish, I think should definitely be lobbied. And it can be really intimidating. I know I say that like very lackadaisically, but speaking to a C-suite executive about these things can be difficult. That being said, I think it's super important to be upfront with these people who are really making a commitment to your organization, because we've also talked about how DEI efforts can seem in some ways like a checking of a box. I know for Box API, we really want to make sure that the people who are going to be serving as our executive sponsors are really, you know, with us for the long haul and really understand what they're stepping into. So to summarize, I think seeing if you can have 2 executive sponsors might be something that could be of interest, someone who is identified as part of your ERG community and someone who maybe it does not, but was willing to serve as an ally, and then being very upfront and forward about what it is that you're expecting from your C-suite executive sponsor.
Tremayne, did you have thoughts kind of around this question too? I might have seen you write something down, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I take a lot of notes. So I do think that, you know, one, I like what Sheldon mentioned. I wonder if you could reverse it though. I wonder if you could look at having an ERG advocate to support each of those C-suite leaders. Because I guarantee you that having somebody from an ERG kind of support them, they could definitely give you a number of suggestions on, here is the business impact that you could have from a diversity standpoint. You know, there's a lot of filters that you can look at, but I just wonder if you would just flip it and reverse it. And the other thing that I think about is listening sessions. I wonder if conducting annual listening sessions and having the entire C-suite as a part of those to have them to really understand like what resonates with them. But conducting listening sessions on an annual basis and not just one person, but having an entire C-suite as a part of that could be beneficial.
So a couple creative kind of ideas there. That's not the traditional format of just aligning one C-suite exec to an ERG as well. I love the idea of reverse mentorship too. I think that is interesting. And I saw Krista's note in the Zoom too around really aligning with middle managers and folks that are not at the, the so to speak top and bottom as well, to make sure that everybody is involved in the process. I think that is really important. A lot of times kind of in these conversations, sometimes people ask around, is there a magic number of folks that you need to have in an organization? Startups that have 10 people, do we need an ERG when they scale to 100? Is that enough? Do you think that there is, is it ever too kind of small of an org to start? Krysta, do you have any kind of thoughts around that?
No, I don't think so. And that's why the part about purpose when you're building is so important. Because if you know the future of your org isn't ever going to be 10,000 employees, it helps you set more realistic expectation about why these ERGs exist and what you're looking to help have their support with in terms of like goals and culture and stuff like that. I think that you could have a company of 10 people and ERGs could still exist, because the idea is that we're not pushing silos of identity. We're pushing not silos of identity. We're pushing intersectionality and unity. And that can look like a whole company sometimes, depending on the industry and the demographics of the group.
Yeah, it is never too early to start. I definitely agree. And again, coming back to intentionality and understanding what you want to accomplish with the community you're creating is really important. I know kind of with the future of work changing, we're all trying to build, or at least it's the optimistic side of me, that we're trying to build more equitable workplaces. Employee engagement is looking different. And we could be pivoting to what membership really looks like. Sheldon, you mentioned kind of one example of just like, the candid conversations that you're having via Zoom. Can you share a little bit about kind of how you see, the future of work impacting community and kind of building that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to say that there weren't any obstacles or difficulties in adopting a strictly virtual sort of environment for our ERG would not be a true statement. There's definitely been some hurdles that we've had to get over, but I think what's one sort of unforeseen silver lining is that when we were all going into the office, and there's been this discussion about silos, the Box API ERG was actually a lot more individual, I guess, in the sense that each office kind of did their own programming, and everyone in a specific office was very close to the other API members that were a part of their office. And it makes sense because they were seeing them on a near daily basis. But I think something that's been really, really cool is that I've been able to speak with people in our New York office and people in Chicago and people in the San Francisco and Redwood City offices. And it's less about these sort of geographical locations and more so about, okay, we all sort of identify as this collective group and this collective ERG truly. So that's been really nice. And I think, I see trends just continuing to at least in the tech space, to continue to be more open to virtual work on a longstanding basis. So I think what that means to ERG leads is just becoming very creative and still maintaining that intentionality, but becoming creative about like programming and really focusing on things that we've discussed, right? Which is really driving the quality of the spaces that are being formed in these events, and also trying to focus on intersectionality. Because I think that's another thing, is when we had events in person, you have that very physical sort of component to everything. But when things are virtual, you lose that. And so it almost is, I shouldn't say almost, it is very much a benefit to have our members also be interacting with people from other ERGs in this virtual space, because for me, it's just like, okay, yeah, the more the merrier, which I think is what Jess was saying. So yeah, being very creative, figuring out ways to still try and instill maybe that physical connection, albeit virtually through event programming, as we kind of look at maybe longer term virtual work, and then continuing to drive emphasis on intersectionality and holding events with other ERCs to kind of bring more people into the room and have much more of a layered and nuanced conversation and narrative.
Bringing more people into the room and into the conversation. I love that. I think that's one of the themes that we're talking about here as well. One of the other kind of questions that someone asked you is, does anyone also have, in addition to employee resource groups, diversity, equity, and inclusion committees or councils that serve as a separate purpose too? I see some head nods. Tremayne, do you want to kind of shed some light there?
Yeah, so before I left Splunk, which is my previous company, we launched a council, which is a global company-wide diversity council. And part of their goals was really to bring the strategy to life together within their functions. So it consisted of people within all functions. I think we had about 15 members on the team. We partnered with the most senior leaders to help recommend names within their teams. And these were like director, senior manager level people that were really embedded. And there were some requirements. They had to be with the company for a certain amount of time, know the ins and outs of how to operationalize initiatives and strategies and some of those things. But I've definitely seen this in most companies where I've been at. And then I would say, one of the other questions too that somebody asked in the group is around, executive sponsorship. I think one of the companies, I hope this is okay to do, is Walmart, I've seen done this really well. Walmart sometimes get a lot of slack, but years ago, they would have executives lined up to serve as executive sponsors. I mean, it was almost really, it was demanded of you, it was expected of you. And so leaders knew that if they wanted to become a VP or SVP, they knew that they had to function as an executive sponsor for one of these teams. So you would never even have an ERG looking and saying, oh, I don't know who my sponsor is going to be, because they would have a choice of many specifically. So it just, it's just how it's embedded and it's enforced and how it's demanded from the C-suite. I think it starts there.
I love that. Do you have something similar to kind of committees or councils in addition to ERGs?
Sorry, you broke up. Did you say me?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
I just asked head nod too, and I wanted to know what the setup was at Sonos too, if you had that as well.
Well, we have a chief diversity, equity, inclusion officer, and while I don't believe that there's a formal committee, I know there's a number of people that work with her to look at how we bring training to managers for bias training and how to conduct interviews, how to be supportive to people within underrepresented groups. So it's more of their role is more of a educational role is kind of my understanding. I don't know that it's completely formal, but that is what I know of. So yeah, I guess my only thinking about it would be that those groups would need to be very closely in touch with ERGs to make sure that no one's speaking for a group without really understanding that group's needs. And I think as long as there's that kind of check and balances, then I think it's a great thing to have.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, kind of education and internal kind of training and programming is something that kind of HR people and maybe committees kind of work together to align on and really collaborate with ERGs on as well, or take something kind of off of their plate in terms of responsibility. I know we talked about a lot of different topics in terms of intersectionality, the more the merrier mentality, really being inclusive, executive sponsorship, and tangible ways to really foster the growth of leaders and the community at large. But I do want to close out our webinar here together by if each of our panelists can share maybe one or two key insights that you hope our audience members are going to take away with them after this conversation. Tremayne, I'll pass it to you first.
I think so. For me, two things that I would like to leave the group is with. For me, I am really I don't want to say passionate, but I'm really sensitive when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the topic is specifically around representation goes to lack of qualifications. I literally cringe in meetings when that comes up. And so I always say what's lacking is the opportunity. Like, we're qualified and we're out there. The opportunity is what's lacking, not the qualifications. So that's one. And then I would say it's not enough to just focus on representation. And as I say, count more heads. We have to also, it's that and again, it's and make sure that we're focusing on making the heads count. So I always like to add that piece. So those are my two things that I would like to leave the group with.
+1 to both of them. I love that. Krysta, what about you?
I think safe spaces and brave spaces. So if you really think about it, like a safe space for people of color might not be a safe space for like a racist, right? So when you think about safe space discussions, how do we push it to be a brave space so that we can have conversations where we learn from each other and we actually get at the root of the issue? What's really here? Anybody who's involved in ERG work at any level, it's a bit scary. This is newer. And when I say newer, I mean like the last 10 to 12 years, right? So having these conversations, having these events, trying to teach people at work about systems that might be perpetuated by family, by loved ones, it can get tough, but don't be scared to have those conversations and to talk about the things that require courage, because otherwise you get down the line. And if all we did was have events and a great time, when you start to talk about what Tremayne just said, like equitable system and inclusive hiring, people are confused. They're like, wait a second, we didn't mean all that. We just meant the parties and the fun stuff. So yeah, just be brave. Exactly. Change is awkward and weird, but super necessary. Yeah.
That's really important. If you want to have the parties and the celebrations, you need to have the hard conversations and really dig into that as well and hold these spaces in a really accountable way. Jess, what are your thoughts?
So when I think about ERGs, I think about this idea that you should be able to be your full and complete self at work. You should never have to hide who you are and the things that are important to you. And ERGs are a great place to foster that. When you come into a new company and you see that they have an ERG, or even when you're looking to go to a new company, if you see that they have a support group for you, a support system in place, they recognize the importance of that safe space. I think that is very powerful. And then it allows you to use that time that you're together to talk about the hard things and help figure out how to move the company forward without doing all the work, right? ERGs are a great way to bring up trends that you're seeing within your community that maybe the company doesn't know about. Work with other groups to recognize some gaps in the way that we hire or the way that we show up in our public facing ways. So ERGs can be very powerful and empowering places, and they can be hard to start, but once you get going, it's probably the reason that I've stayed at Sonos as long as I have.
I love that. Thank you. And Sheldon, what are your parting kind of thoughts or wisdom with us?
Yeah, I'd hate to be that person to just piggyback off of what everyone else said, but I think over the course of this discussion or this question, 2 Box company values have kind of come to the forefront of my mind. So to Jess's point, Box has a value called bring your blank self to work. So the blank is intentional. It's whatever you would like to put in there. And so I think that ERGs really embody that Box value, because I know that anytime I enter into a ERG meeting for Box API, I'm bringing my best self to work. I'm bringing my brightest self to work. I'm bringing, my most courageous self to work, because that's what the title involves. And I'm glad to do it because I love the community so much. And I love the just aspect of being a part of an ERG and being a part of a community at work. I think it's amazing. And then the other core Box value that comes to mind is being candid and assuming good intent. So going back to what Krysta was saying, that holding safe spaces, but also holding brave spaces. Candor isn't always easy, and it's usually something, I think, looking back at this past year and a half, that certain topics of discussion have kind of risen to the surface, and it's not comfortable, and it's not easy to talk about these things, but it is so necessary. And it's important to, when engaging in those kinds of conversations, both as someone who's maybe bringing it up, but even someone who is an ally and is listening, if there is something that is stated or something that is said that either you are bringing to the table or someone else is bringing to the table, and you feel a little bit uncertain about it, I think it is a really good thing to just take a step back and assume that that person has good intent. They're saying these things because it's really been something at the forefront of their mind, and it isn't something that they can separate from their work life, right? This is something that's part of who they are, and they need, to bring it up in conversation and have a discussion about it. So yeah, I think that ERGs provide a space for that, and for a multitude of reasons, they're so important. But those were kind of two things that really came to mind as people were sharing their responses.
Yeah, absolutely. ERGs provide incredible value, and we're talking about intentionality, the importance of intersectionality, and all the different ways that their work manifests throughout the organization, and the importance of compensating and recognizing leaders. Thank you all so much for being on our panel discussion. I know we went a couple of minutes over, but we really appreciate it. If you want to see the recording of our webinar, it'll be on our website as well. But thank you so much to our audience too for listening in. And to reiterate, for those who aren't familiar with AllVoices, we truly believe in creating that safe space for employee feedback to build a culture of trust, inclusion, and transparency at companies around the world, and really believe in that psychological safety. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and all of our panelists are on LinkedIn. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.